All right, we are back with our Agile100 online conference. It was already a great start with Gitta, and she followed my asking and basically answered all the remaining questions in the chat. Next up is Paris Thomas, and not only does Paris have amazing presentation skills in a virtual world, but he also is the managing director of Open Box Communication. He will do a proper introduction himself. And he's an executive advisor to Strategizer, the company co-founded by Alex Osterwalder, where they do a lot of work both with startups, but also larger organizations. And today, Paris will talk with us about the amazing insights he has had from working with so many startups and with so many innovation departments in large organizations. Paris, I hand over to you. It's your stage.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Saurabh. Thank you for the invitation to participate at this conference. And you had quoted me earlier that I had said something about staying relevant is no longer an option; it's a survival tactic. And I think that being agile is the most important thing you can do to stay relevant. So, along those lines, today I will be talking about a topic called "What can really happen when corporates build experiments." And so, just to set the scene a little bit on what I mean by that is that companies all over the world frequently launch new products and services in the market. And one of the big statistics that we're trying to reduce is that 7 out of 10 of these products or services fail. And so what's happening is that organizations are frequently conducting experiments in order to reduce the risk of failure. But there's a lot of people in the audience. For different people, it will resonate differently when I say the word experiments. And so I'll position it as I go along. There is a science behind this, but there's also a bit of an art. So we're talking about what companies do frequently in order to reduce the risk of new ideas launching. And when they start to create experiments in the market, what are the types of things that can go wrong? So let me just position who is this guy? Well, aside from the fact that I'm a bit of a tech geek, there you go. And I'll be doing some interesting things today. I'm the managing director of a company called Open Box Communication, and I am here with you live from Limassol, Cyprus. And what we do is we help companies change. And as everybody knows, whenever there's change, there's always madness. So we've come up with this little, very simple formula of a method to the madness. And so what this formula looks like is that there's 3 key ingredients. And the first one is people. The second one is strategy. And the third one is systems. I double in all of these 3 areas, and it's the interplay of how these 3 ingredients come together that define if you're going to be successful in change. But today, specifically, I'm going to be talking about strategy. And strategy in the context and with the hat that I wear as executive advisor to, like you said, Strategizer. So just a couple of words about Strategizer and the context and the mindset that I'm going to be talking about. Strategizer is a Swiss-based firm. And responsible for founding the tools of the business model canvas and value proposition canvas. I'm confident a lot of the audience has heard of these tools before. I'll show a couple in a second, but these are the tools that companies use today in order to launch new ideas in the market. They're also best-selling authors of 4 amazing books. If you don't believe me, here they are. And these are business model generation, value proposition design, testing business ideas, which is somewhat the context that I'll be talking about today, and the most recently launched book, The Invincible Company. In addition to this, Alexander Osterwalder, like you mentioned before, and his co-author Yves Pigneur have been listed as in the 4th place of the Thinkers 50, receiving a lot of attention about the thought leadership they bring into the world. In my view, and you can tell I'm in love with these products and their thinking, I think they're the hottest thing since the 4-quadrant matrix as a consultant. So that's definitely something to pay attention to. Let me start with one statement. A corporate startup is not the same as a startup. A corporate startup is a definition we use when we talk about innovation teams. And these innovation teams are tasked with being involved in what we call sprints. And these sprints may last from anywhere from 3 months to up to 2 years. They're broken down into phases. And what their goal is to launch a new product or service in the market, but through the process of business modeling, their goal is to reduce the risk that comes with any new idea and innovation. However, if you call them a corporate startup, there's something misleading. They're not a startup because they're, let's say, a startup within a corporate is not a startup. Why? Because unlike startups, they have unlimited resources. They're not founders or owners of a business, they're employees. The way they're being assessed and their performance appraisals, their metrics are different. One day they're in that team, another day they've shifted to another department or maybe another company. The ingredients are very different. Probably the most important one is the way they make decisions and how agile they are is way different than a startup. So if you were to look at a startup as being the most agile entity, the complete opposite of that is a corporate startup. But there's things we can do about that. So let me just set that as a scene in which some of the things start to go wrong. And before I move on, maybe another thing that's worth mentioning is the corporate startups and just generally corporates, the way they communicate is also different in terms of being more silos as opposed to a blender, which is the reality of startups. So today, what I have on the agenda for you on the menu is, well, I'm going to start by talking about why do companies test? Just a few brief comments on why do they test in the first place before we can talk about and what can go wrong when they start to do these tests and experiments. And finally, this is interesting, is what goes wrong when their tests go right? Okay, so let's say you do these tests, they went well, but what else can go wrong? So let's begin with the first one, which is why do companies test in the first place? And so to do that, I'm going to be asking the audience a question. I wish I could see all of you, but I can't. So I'm going to ask you to do a pretend game with me. And the question I have for you is, how does a dog drink water? And what I want you to do, wherever you are, home, office, at a hotel, lounge somewhere, just stick your hand out in the air. Don't worry about what people think of you right now. And pretend this is the tongue of a dog. What motion would your hand make? And I'm imagining now, you can also imagine I've asked this question a few times before, that some of you are going this way, others are going this way, some of you might be going this way. There's definitely going to be a disagreement into how we answer this question. So the follow-up question I have for you is, how would you go about validating this? I mean, I can do something here. I don't know if you have access to a dog, but I do. So this is Jesse. And I can ask Jesse, who is not so happy to be, how do you drink water? And I'm not going to get an answer. So that's not going to be okay. That's not a good experiment. We should probably move away from that. And what I could do is try something different. We can all do this. You have a smartphone in front of you in your pocket. I'm sure there's a smartphone within 50 centimeters from you. In that smartphone, you have a very powerful camera. And that camera has a very powerful feature, which is slow motion video. I don't expect you to go out now and find a dog and do this. I've done it for you. Let's watch what happens when a dog drinks water. And here are the results. As you can see, the tongue makes an inverse cup. Now, for those of you who did not know this, and this may have been keeping you up at night, tonight you can rest assured you can have a good night's sleep. But for those of you who knew this, well done, congratulations. You validated what you already knew, which is also equally as important. My message here is that what we believe is sometimes based on assumptions, even if it's as trivial as how does a dog drink water. Now, if it's not as trivial, and it's more important because millions of dollars are at stake, then here's what we do. Here's how I can position this. Well, first of all, we go into this discussion of when we launch a new product, there's two phases to taking that, to going about that. The first phase I would call the search and test, where you're searching for a repeatable and scalable business model. And the second stage is the execution, where you're actually applying the product in the market and seeing how it works. In the search and test phase, the job of an innovation team or any corporate startup or any startup for that is to reduce the risk. And so they're trying to reduce the risk. How are they reducing the risk? By conducting experiments. However, these experiments are not free. And so these experiments cost money, but the way you provide that funding is like drip irrigation. A little bit of money at a time. As your certainty increases or confidence increases because you've reduced your risk, you increase the amount of spending. And before anybody asks, and maybe already somebody's asking, when do you know when you've done enough testing and you want to move on to the next stage, well, getting to the decision point of progress before you can do some execution is not a black or white question. That's a question that is different for every single situation. You may do enough testing. Maybe it's an issue of time. Maybe your leaders have said, you've proven the point, let's launch. But what you're trying to do is provide evidence, scientific evidence, that your assumptions will hold in the market. And to do that, there is a lot of information. And I'm picking on the book of Testing Business Ideas, co-authored by David Bland and Alexander Osterwalder, that actually gives you some inspiration with 44 business experiments. To create a little bit more of context here, these experiments are categorized in certain ways. And I'm drawing from IDEO's model of desirability, feasibility, and viability. And this fits really nicely over the business model canvas. Again, for those of you who may have not seen the business model canvas before, this is a very simple, but not necessarily easy tool where you have 9 boxes that help you describe how any business, new idea or existing, creates, delivers, and captures value from the marketplace. Unlike a business plan, which is more execution focused, a business model is more about the conceptual aspects of how would you go about doing this. And so when you take these 3 things and superimpose them on the business model canvas, you're asking the questions of desirability. Do my customers want this? Feasibility. Can we actually build it? Viability. Will it make profit? And there's one more, adaptability, which is what you see at the bottom there, which is, will this work in the market, in the business environment? Will it be able to scale? Now, what innovation teams do is they're constantly asking the question, what needs to be true for this idea to work? So in a typical innovation process, what happens is that these teams start to develop not one, but multiple business models, also value propositions. And they're constantly trying to extract from these models all the assumptions, like, do I think the dog drinks water this way or that way? And they're formulating them in what we call hypotheses. And these hypotheses are then to be tested. So you ask all these questions that are being extracted from all of these different boxes. And then eventually, when you start to look at your business model in context, what you do is you rank them. And this is where the 4 quadrant matrix comes in, with rating them as either important to your business model or not so important. Not so important means there may be another way, but important means without this being true, we can't move forward. And then on the x-axis, you're looking at, do we have evidence for this particular hypothesis today? Or do we have no evidence for this hypothesis? And so what happens is that you start to sort all these different hypotheses. And then obviously, as you can imagine, where you focus your testing and experimentation is the top right quadrant, the ones that are really important, fundamental to your business model to work, for your business model to work, but you don't have sufficient evidence yet in order to be able to do that. Now, step 2 would be entering this sort of the design and test loop where you've designed all these things and you've extracted hypotheses. Now that you've done the hypothesizing, you start to design experiments, and then you launch these experiments in the market, and I'll talk about types of experiments. From these, you learn, and then from that learning, you collect your insights, you have a discussion with your team, and you make a decision. Do we go back in the design loop and come up back again with some more testing, or do we have enough to make progress? So that was part 1 of my presentation here, which was all to do with why do companies test in the first place? And it is, again, to reduce the risk of new ideas. Now, the second thing we're going to talk about is what can go wrong. And so if we look at a process, first of all, you begin with having the solid hypothesis, and I described sort of how we end up with these hypotheses. Then you enter the testing phase. And then once the testing phase is complete, you analyze the insights. Where things go wrong is in the testing phase. At least the majority of the time, when things go wrong is in the testing phase. So let's focus on that. The testing phase is made up of 2 parts. First is choosing the appropriate test or experiment. And the second is when you're trying to implement the test. I'll talk about both. Let's begin with choosing the appropriate test. And I'm going to give you some examples. Now, as you can imagine, and if some of you may be consultants yourself, you have strict NDAs with your corporate clients. So seldomly, most of the times you're not allowed to talk about what they do. I wish I could, but I can't. So I'm going to talk about Chrysalis Leap, which is another hat I wear, which is an accelerator based in Cyprus, but operating with the help of the European Union. And every year we organize the largest green business ideas competition on the planet. There's now 60 countries participating. This year, it's the 7th year we're running this. And our mantra is we can fix climate change one startup at a time. So I'm drawing on this example and hopefully directing your attention to this initiative. Perhaps you can participate. A lot of volunteer work involved in that. And I'm going to use some of these startups as examples, but rest assured, it's the exact same things that are happening in corporate, probably even worse. So in this particular example, this is a startup from Lithuania. Their value is they're trying to prolong the shelf life of fruit. Their hypothesis here is that we believe that people from Lithuania who travel at least monthly will show interest in our product through filling out a survey on our website. And they did. Now, what happened is that they created a website, and on that website, they put a call to action, fill out survey. When is the last time you personally have gone to visit a website and filled out a survey? I mean, if somebody calls you, you don't have to do anything. Somebody just calls you. All you have to do is answer the phone and asks you questions. You're itching to go away, or you'll probably lie to get out of it. What are the chances you would fill out a survey? You'd be surprised as to how many people still think surveys are a valid way of getting relevant consumer insight. And obviously, they got 0 responses. Oh, they invited people through Facebook ads and all that. Now, what they ended up doing was, we went back to the fundamentals. And what they created was a tear-out sheet. Many of you have seen these in coffee shops where somebody's selling a used bicycle and they show the picture of it, price. And if you're interested, tear out one of these sheets at the bottom. So what they did is they went to different retail locations, airport lounges, grocery shops. They placed the same banners. And then they came back a week later and counted how many tear-out sheets are missing. Now, as trivial as that may sound, the number of tear-out sheets missing is a metric that is solid evidence. When you couple that with how many people actually visited the website, that's even more powerful. So this is what I mean when I talk about experiments. And there are many different types. Some of them are digital, some of them are offline. They tried to go digital with this example, but then they realized that going offline was a better way to go. So I'm not going to focus too much on choosing an appropriate test. I think that's a long conversation, and it really varies per case. But the tested validity has to be solid. The second thing is what happens when they implement the test. And I see even more problems going wrong here. So here's another example from another startup. These guys in Greece, they're working on producing biodegradable acoustic panels. Their value proposition or their hypothesis is that they believe that 10 amateur musicians in Greece from the ages of 18 to 40 will pre-order the product, so purchase it before it's ready in the market, through their landing page. And this was one of their hypotheses. Now, let me just say that this is a popular test, creating a landing page, offering some sort of value proposition, and then having some sort of call to action, and all these things vary, is quite a popular test. So I'm focusing a little bit on this one as I think it's probably more relevant. So here is their website. And I'm going to ask the audience, can you tell me what is wrong with this website? And Saurabh, maybe you can help me here. What do people think is wrong? Type it in chat. And I'm hoping we don't have a lot of delay in the live feed here, but maybe Saurabh, you can just unmute and tell me what people are saying.
Yes, happy to do that. So there is a few seconds delay. So let's just give people a few seconds to hear your question and then start typing into the chat. Now let me see what might be wrong with that website myself.
Let me get out of the way.
Okay, I have a few suspicions, yeah. Let's see. So Gavin, while you're asking what's the name of the volunteering platform for ideas against climate change, I think it's the Climate Launchpad, Paris, right?
ClimateLaunchpad.org. Okay, we got responses coming in.
Yeah, I don't get what the product is, and not clear what the product offered is. Insecure website. It's not safe. Not a secure website. What exactly am I pre-ordering? Privacy error. No HTTPS. So a lot of things around security.
Yeah. And that's it. So you're also identifying correctly that there's other things about being unclear, and eventually they refine the website to make it a bit more clear. You also can imagine that you would scroll down and you would see more, but the biggest issue is the privacy error. And you have to understand that the privacy error in some browsers like Chrome browser, this isn't what you see when you first go to the website. You get a big screen that says this site is unsafe, kind of enter at your own risk type of language. And so you even have to take some action and take some risk before you even go here. What are the chances you're going to even pay to buy something on this website? Zero. And that's exactly what their metrics was. Now, this isn't a web development conference. So, but I am emphasizing that when you're a corporate startup and you're an engineer, a technician somewhere, a lawyer or whatever organization or industry that may be in, the chances that you've developed a website before and know all about web design are not that great. Now, you may be a hobbyist, but there's multiple innovation teams. So there's a lot that people don't know they don't know. And hence, let me walk you through some of the biggest challenges when creating this, which is the most popular experiment, a landing page. And it starts with the domain name. The domain name, if you're a startup, and I won't go into asking the audience, but I can tell you what they tell me. If you're a startup and you're interested in purchasing a new domain, it takes you literally 3 to 5 minutes to purchase it. You do this on your phone in no time. If you're a corporate startup, that answer goes up to 3 weeks because it has to be approved brand-wise, budget-wise, purpose-wise, due diligence-wise. It's not the same story. That's why I keep saying a corporate startup is not a startup. What do we do about that? We'll wait until the end. So it starts with that. The second thing is a lot of the corporate startups go out and buy and get free domains like awesomeproduct.wix.com. Your test is dead before you start it because now everybody knows you're not a serious company. This is a free domain. Or they might go to their IT department and say, can we host this website for external people to come in so they can visit this website? That way we save money. We don't have to do external hosting, aside from the fact that it's going to be probably 3-month delay before you get all that stuff set up internally. When people come to your site, very likely because you're not a professional hosting company, your site is going to be sluggish. And 53% of your visitors will leave your site if it takes more than 3 seconds to load. So that's another thing that can go wrong. Another thing that can go wrong is the SSL certificate, which is what causes the privacy error. An SSL certificate costs a little bit of money. You need to have some technical knowledge to install it, but without that, nowadays, you're getting this privacy error. The list goes on. If you're in Europe, GDPR compliance, which is our Data Protection Act, and how we collect and how we treat and how we store and how we deal and how we use data that we collect. Because an experiment is designed to collect data. Well, you need to have some solid GDPR policy on there. Do you want to talk to your legal counsel in your company as you're trying to be agile? Have you ever tried that before? So obviously that's going to cause some delays. And these are some of the things, again, that can go wrong when companies start to implement these tests. Moving on, analytics. Why do an experiment if you're not going to plug the analytics so you can see where are people scrolling? What are they watching? And I'll show an example later. So that's something that is often neglected. And then design and user experience. So 94% of first impressions are design related. And because not all of us are designers, we will be happy with what we created, if that's what we're doing it internally. But then eventually when users come, there's a good chance they're not going to be happy with what they see and they'll leave. And the same thing goes with the UX. The whole experience, if you're searching for the button or searching to learn more, but you can't find it, things are in the wrong place because you're not an expert, you're going to have 55% people leaving in less than 15 seconds after looking to find the appropriate button. And after all of this stuff, which a lot of it is technical, and again, we're not all web developers to know how to create an experiment that does this, then you also have to worry about rich content. What are we going to put up there? How is it written? Are there spelling mistakes? Will there be a video? What is the call to action? What are we putting on the website as content? So that's where a lot of these things are nowadays becoming more popular and people are talking about them. And David Bland and Alex Osterwalder in this book are giving us many examples of different types of experiments that are split into 2 parts. The first one is called discovery experiments. I'm just going to read some of the headlines here. You're looking at preference and prioritization. I started the other way around. Exploration. You're looking at data analysis or trying to discover if there is interest. So several experiments that are for the purpose of discovering if there's interest, or maybe having a discussion with a prototype in hand. So having that conversation with your users or end customers with a prototype in hand that could be 3D printed or whatever. Or even looking at their preferences and prioritizing what are the features that matter the most. So some of these things are just some ideas of some of the experiments in the discovery domain. There's also experiments in the validation domain, which have to do with interacting with more high fidelity prototypes or having call to actions that show truly what people's intentions are. So the whole website landing page analogy or example of talking about and saying it's popular is really because if there's landing pages that do fake sales where you can click on buy now, and you might even be asked to insert your credit card information. And after that, you might get the signal that says, this was an experiment. We have not collected any data. Would you be interested in being the first to be notified if this goes in the market? Now, some of you are probably pushing your chair back now and thinking, is that even legal? And it's not in every country, so check before you do this. But if you think about doing that, isn't that way more valid than you go to your friends, loved ones, and some customers you already know, and you say, hey, would you buy this product? And they tell you yes, and you end up opening champagne bottles because of that. The reality is that people don't know why they do what they do, especially when it comes to purchasing decisions. So call to action type of experiments give you much more solid evidence, which reduces the risk of failure when you launch your product or service. Simulations and lots of other things. So here's some tangible examples from real client work. These are what we call customer value scenes. And in this experiment, you create a storyboard that you play back to your potential customer during an interview situation. You're trying to get them to see your vision and co-create with you early on. What are the types of things they would like to see? And you're also checking for preferences, priorities, lots of interesting things. But why am I calling this an experiment? Because first of all, can you draw? If you can't, you need to get a graphic designer. Do you have the budget? How quickly can you get one? So in the structures that I'll talk about later, innovation teams can do this in 24 hours because you need to be agile. You need to be moving fast. And so creating these artifacts, assets that you use in your experimentation process is where a lot of things go wrong and people get stuck. By the same token, you can do a whiteboard video, you know, the ones where the hand draws what the story says, or an animation, and both of these things you can put on a landing page, real example here, and you can have people watch that video, and then once they've watched it, maybe click to find out more or subscribe or be notified, whatever your metric is, whatever your call to action might be. 3D printed prototypes, if you're curious about what those acoustic panels look like, this is one. Or, like I've shown before, tear out sheets and many, 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 many others. Now, the analytics that I suggested earlier, heat maps, scroll maps, where are people pausing with their mouse? How long did they watch the video before they dropped? Where did their IP come from? Which countries are they visiting? What are their demographics? There's so much data that we now capture legally on a website because somebody has visited that link. So there's a lot of interesting experiments you can run with that. So for me, that was the short section on where some things can go wrong when companies, corporates run experiments, and the list is endless. Now, the final question I wanted to entertain in this conversation is what goes wrong when their tests go right? So what do I mean by that? First of all, when I say their tests go right, it means that they had an assumption, hypothesis, they had an experiment, they launched the experiment, they got the metrics they wanted before they got the metrics, which is important. They decide on their success metric before they launch the experiment. And now they're celebrating and asking their leadership to give them more money to move forward with execution. And so one of the things that I see typically happen in corporate startups is that they overly focus on the positive outcomes and neglect to focus on some of the negative outcomes. So a lot of people approach this with a checklist mentality. And what that means is that they say, well, before we didn't do any tests. And now we run 5. One of them was successful. Let's launch. It's not like that. You have to look at some of the negatives. You have to look at, the positives and ask yourself again, is it true that it's that good? And so could I run another experiment perhaps to revalidate this from a different perspective? So I see a lot of teams rush the second good news comes through the door. Another one is they lack scalability. Let me clarify what I mean by that. You launch experiments because ultimately you want to launch a product or a service in the market. Some of these experiments are related to feasibility, which relates to can we do it? And therefore, you might get excited about using free online tools to create a visual database that has some feature for your product, whatever that is. And then one day you've proven that there's need in the market. You go to your IT and say, build it. And they say, we can't because this tool that you've selected doesn't talk to this API, or we can't have this because there's a restriction internally in our organization that doesn't allow this. So you've spent a lot of time de-risking a product that you can't even build. And so these things are real. They happen all the time. And lack of scalability is one that needs to be considered from the beginning. Once we've proven desirability, can we build it is also another area where corporate startups need to be testing. And then connected to this is lack of buy-in. The failure to include stakeholders, internal stakeholders, right from the beginning. So you're running or sprinting on your own or with your team. You're super excited. You got some fantastic news from the market. You've gone through this process that is actually admittedly very fun. And you come back and say, let's launch. And people say, what? Who are you? What have you been working on? What about our due diligence? What about our lawyers? What did our CFO have to say? Nobody knows you were doing any of this. And so then you come to the reality. Like Mike Tyson says, you can plan all you want, but all your plans are out once you get punched in the face. So you don't want to be punched in the face by your very own people. So you need to create that buy-in right from the beginning as you launch into your sprint. So I had 3 things to talk about, but obviously I think I've asked more questions than answered. So here's the final one as a bonus to talk about. So what should we do in order to make sure we don't get these things wrong, or we get less things wrong? And I have 3 main points. First of all, you need to create teams that have no barrier setup, a no barrier setup to prototyping. And what I mean by that is enabling the teams with a budget that they don't have to go for tenders, that they don't have to go for approvals, basically sunk cost. Here's 5, 10, 15,000 euros. And this obviously depends on size of company and all that stuff, but typically these are the budgets for prototyping at early stage. Experiment, tell me what's going on, let's get some evidence. And then the second thing is how you build those experiments. Now, sometimes I see companies go to marketing, advertising agencies. You can do that, but you need to have that conversation because you're not looking for final products or pretty advertising or stuff that's going to take 4 months to develop. You're looking for prototyping, which means 20% of the effort for 80% of the result. And so for our internal clients, we offer this service called Prototype Concierge. And that's basically a white glove service to say, do you want to build a landing page? We'll take care of that because we know how to build it for you, or a video or whatever that is. But we're doing that with existing clients to say, we're going to expedite how you actually create or build these experiments so we don't run into these issues. But not everybody has that choice. So this is why I'm talking to you about being aware of some of these obstacles. Then another topic is on how to reduce that less things go wrong, is to test the same hypotheses from multiple angles. You can run different tests, different nature tests. Some of them can be offline, some of them can be online, different groups, different channels, and test the same hypothesis. And the thing is, I find a lot of teams not doing that because they're content with getting the first good results. And then the final one is involving other internal stakeholders early. So think of this as my summary of where I see things going wrong, and involving internal stakeholders early to say, hey, Mr. Legal Department, or hey, Mr. CFO, or whoever that important stakeholder is for the execution of your idea, how about we have a quick coffee and talk about what we're doing as a team, because we'd love to get your feedback. And so when you do celebrate at the end, they're celebrating with you as opposed to putting a wet blanket on your excitement. So that is what I wanted to talk about today. I hope I've given you some sense of what experimentation refers to when I talk about corporate experiments, why they do it, and what are some of the things that go wrong, and what can we start to think about in order to make sure that less of those things go wrong. You can find my contacts. This is a QR code for LinkedIn. You can take a screenshot, or you can see it on the slideshow when I send the slides at the end of this, and I'd be happy to connect. Saurabh, back to you.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Paris. What an amazing presentation. Now, Paris, the very first, I think like 10 or 12 questions were all about your technical setup and how you're doing this presentation the way you did it. can you give us like a few hints on that? I think this would be a presentation by itself, but in a few words, if there's a few tips that you can give, and then we move to the other content relevant questions.
Yeah, I'm willing to bet there's also questions if I'm using which is a service that's being built right now. I'm not. Is probably building something that will apply to and be more scalable to more people, because everybody nowadays is looking at how to make presentations more fun. The bad news is that my setup is insanely difficult to explain. It's complicated, but it's hardware based. So a couple of things I'll say is that there's a lot of hardware connectivity in this. My personal pivot as an entrepreneur has been to convert my office to a studio. And so there's 11 monitors that I can see right now. There's probably more. There's hardware that's being used for video mixing, and there's all sorts of recipes and quick buttons. What I will tell you, if you're super passionate about learning more, there's 2 industries out there that are leading this, and they were leading this already before coronavirus. And those are gamers, because they're really good at streaming content and making it interesting and engaging. And the hardware they use is what I have in the office. And houses of worship, churches, especially in North America, that have been streaming the service have become really good at this. So there's tons of YouTube videos you can watch, or you can wait until services like which I love that you can say with your mouth full, can come into the market and make this applicable to everybody from a software perspective.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Paris. Now let's go into questions related to your presentation, not the way you presented. And the very first one came from Gavin. And Gavin was asking, what are the biggest challenges you have faced when investigating risk reduction for new ideas? And I think this is especially related to the context of corporate startups, not necessarily like regular startups.
Some of the biggest challenges that I've faced are, and I don't know if you would expect this, but teams leave. You start with a corporate innovation team that is tasked with, pursuing this moving forward, and then reorganization happens and you lose members. There's budget contingencies because of whatever else is happening externally. Some new leadership, and then things change. And so, because these are not short-term engagements, I mean, the 3-month innovation sprint, quite targeted, still early on. The real, I would say, the more elaborate and to me interesting results come from these longer growth funnel solutions that are discovery, validation, and acceleration. So 3 phases. And you can imagine by the time you get to acceleration, their world has changed, let alone the market. And by then, you constantly have to deal with these sort of shifting plates. And so that's, to me, the biggest challenge. I think it's one that needs to be addressed. And we address it early on by looking at how do we get commitment from leadership to make sure that these things don't become showstoppers to what otherwise seems to be a beautiful process of de-risking ideas.
Yeah. And is it only that it's the commitment of leadership why people leave, or why those teams are inconsistent? Or is it also a question of, like, I haven't been working in a large corporation, but I assume that if you're in one of those teams, there might not be a clear career path, right? You're not the owner of that startup. And if that idea does not become as great as you expect it to be, it might actually be a showstopper for you in terms of your career. Is that assumption correct to some extent?
Not as much from my experience. And the reason I say that is because typically these teams come together and the expectation is that they'll spend 20% of their time working on this project. So doesn't replace, it just adds to their existing workload. Now, the reality is that their manager doesn't say that you're going to do. Sorry, say again?
I was saying that's another problem by itself, that it's only 20% and not,
So that's a problem. And the other problem is that their manager doesn't tell them you're going to do 20% less of your day job. So what you end up happening is 120%. But do you know what? That's great. And people who know me know I'm really direct and ruthless about these things. You want to build a new product, you want to go into the innovation world, you want to be an entrepreneur or an intrapreneur in your company, you better bite the bullet and realize that this is really hard work. And if you don't have what it takes to do 120 or 200%, you're not going to be successful anyway. So this is a good filter for me. And I love the teams that come in, they get totally jazzed with all the energy of this innovation thing. And they say, you know what, I'm going to work extra because I'm loving this. Because the other thing is they're learning. And one of the selfish things that I tell my teams is that it doesn't matter where you go in your career, in this company or in other companies, what you're going to learn, what you're about to embark on this journey, you can start your own company at the end of this. And so they go, oh, you know what? Okay, it's in it for them too. And I think that's a good way to create some perspective.
Cool. So let's go to the next one, coming from Vin. He's asking, typically when I use the term experiment, people start looking funny at me. Like, you think we're putting time and money into experiments? Is there a better way to call it, or should I just point them at this presentation?
The one word that you can, if you think this presentation is going to do it for them, the one word that I feel applies to everybody, leaders and executors alike, is de-risking. And so you can talk about experiments as a way of de-risking ideas, but I think, as in everything, when you're communicating, you need to create the right context. And that's also why I said this is why they do tests or experiments, because we're trying to de-risk. Now, if you're not in a lab setting, the word experiment is foreign in and of itself. So it's your responsibility to create that context. And I think focusing on de-risking, or the metric, feel free to use it. 7 out of 10 new ideas that are launched in the market fail. So can we reduce that number? We can reduce the risk by doing this business modeling thing. I think that's a good intro.
Okay, cool. I think de-risking is a term that I will certainly steal or borrow. Now, the next one is coming from Boris, and he says the following. My recent experience, about 2 years, from my master's studies was that we were asked to do surveys in order to collect data for business research. Just talked about the less value of surveys. Now, it seems surveys are still considered by academics one of the main data collection tools for business research projects. You indicated some alternatives. Do you know if there is some broader research on how to engage with consumers that you could point us to where we could find alternatives to surveys with their corresponding strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah, and I think the best resource for that is looking at books like Testing Business Ideas that give you alternatives. I think there is no, in my mind at least, don't do surveys, do this instead. This instead is a series of things that you approach from a different angle. I think what's important, there's a great book out there called Predictably Irrational that talks about how irrational our decisions are. And because there's a lot of us in the world, you can predict our stupidity, basically. And so there's interesting information about when you understand human behavior, and this is a game of human behavior, because ultimately you want to make sure you launch a product that the people who said they're going to buy it do buy it. And so when we talk surveys, there is lots of ambiguity whether the answer we're giving is correct, incorrect, whether we're responding quickly or we don't care about it. There's no way to measure the validity of each and every single person who responded to that survey, but it's easy. Everybody can build a survey. You get data. You know what data gives you? Beautiful graphs. And those graphs go into some nice slides, and we get our job done. We report to who we report to, checkbox, let's go home. Now, if this was your business, would you have done that and be satisfied? No. That's why you're not a corporate startup. You need to be thinking like an owner of a startup and start to understand you care about the validity of the data you produce. And a survey is meaningless when you're building a company. You might do it early on just to get a sense of trends and this and that, but then just throw it away and work on real experiments that give you valid data.
Yeah, no, that's really good. So for example, when I teach my product owner classes, we build like an ideal product. And every time I ask people to create like a test, it's always a survey. It's always a survey. And then we go into this topic of, okay, one way to make your test more valid, more add validity to it is that you have an action item or a call to action in there. And you mentioned like you can have videos where people can subscribe. All of that includes a call to action. And there are some famous examples out there. I mean, one of the most famous one is from Dropbox, which ultimately ended up to be a really, really good product. Now, let's go to Peter. He's asking, Thomas, how can corporates possibly act so as to be as quick as real startup? What are the 3 things? I guess Peter is a consultant, always asking about 3 things. What are the 3 things you can recommend?
And as you saw in my presentation, everything is in 3s as well. What are the 3 things I would recommend? So good, rule of 3. So let's do it. First thing I would do is make sure that the leadership is aligned, that failure is acceptable, right? And so Jeff Bezos, the whole narrative of we weren't failing fast enough, and not many companies think that way. You can say that I'm claiming the example of a unicorn, but the reality is there. No, companies are not failing fast enough. And the problem isn't that we're not failing fast enough, is that we should be failing faster and cheaper. And I think that if leadership abides to that, then that is the be all end all. So and you can imagine that around this topic is how do you measure failure if you're being assessed on success? There's a lot of HR issues in that. So leadership conversation around failure, that's your headline. Number 2 is resources. Enable these teams with the right resources, whether that's a small prototype fund or a lab or a space or time off, whatever that is, or additional help, volunteers, student, whatever that is. Give them the chance to sprint. Okay, don't overfeed them. They're not going to be able to walk too fast. They're going to be happy with the food you gave them. Just give them enough to make them still hungry to sprint, so they can also be agile in their thinking, right? If they don't have too much budget, they're kind of being smarter about where they're spending their money, which is the behavior you see in startups that don't have a lot of money. So give them the resources and let them fly on their own. So that's your second one. And your third one, I would say, pick the right team. In the old days, well, not so old, maybe 15 years ago, you'd have CEOs say, we need to reinvent ourselves. Let's get our top strategy people in a room and figure it out. If you look at the profile of those top strategy people, they're all probably MBAs. They have the same background, very similar demographics, and they're trying to figure out a problem that applies to every single person on the planet. And so I feel, I see, I hear, I am experiencing the power of our differences when we come together as a multidisciplinary team. And you get your salesperson, your marketing person who traditionally fight, your accounting person, your HR person, your operations guy, whatever those functions of your company are, and you make little microcosms of teams of 4 to 6 people, which is a healthy number, and you let them carry that project forward. And then you start to see fireworks happen because it's very different to have a multidisciplinary with different backgrounds and experiences together. Now, sometimes that's not always functional or real or possible. In those cases, what I would say is then go to them and talk to them. Don't exclude them. So make sure they're included in the process. Those are what I would say top 3 out of my mind.
Okay. So there was failure, there was resources, and then ultimately it was the team. Right?
Yeah.
Now, what I've seen a lot happen, both in real startups and in corporate startups, when they come up with an idea, they tend to fall in love with that idea, right? Now, Christoph is asking, what do you suggest to corporate startups to avoid falling in love to their ideas too early? Because that's a challenge, right?
I once did a workshop, okay, I'll leave everything unnamed here, where very important, huge company, Fortune 500, and I asked them to design a business model. And then after about 20 minutes, I asked them to stand at the front of the stage and tear it. So I took a business model and I did just do what I do, and I tore the business model. And they did it, but then people started yelling and shouting and saying, what a waste of time this was, and 20 minutes and all our ideas are gone. And then the golden question, if you have so many emotions about your first idea you spent 20 minutes on, and you can't even change that, what are the chances you're going to change an idea you spent $1 million on, right? And so it's awareness, and it's education, and it's them experiencing the fact that, first of all, you can't afford to fall in love with your initial idea. That's the biggest thing that everybody does. And you can't afford not to be upset when somebody tells you your baby is ugly. And those words make people cringe. And it's people like me who tell them that, no, your baby's ugly. I mean, it looks bad. You do it again. So here's a tip here's a tip I'll take from a common friend of ours, Holger, who is a graphic artist, and he helps a lot with these drawings and illustrations that look very similar to what Saurabh has behind him. We did a public workshop once with Holger here in Cyprus, and he spoke about the beauty of ugliness. I thought this was a brilliant concept, which was if you're designing your idea in a sketch form that looks like chicken scratch, and it just is whatever napkin sketch like, versus you design your idea that looks like a piece of art. You've colored it, you've shadowed it, lines are more even, things look beautiful. And you take these two ideas to, same person, and you ask them to challenge these ideas. You're not going to get a lot of challenges from the beautiful idea because people don't want to hurt your feelings. But on the ugly idea, they're going to be, oh yeah, this is ugly. He didn't spend much time on it. I'm going to tell him what I think. So you've inadvertently given them permission to crap all over your idea because of that beauty of ugliness. It's the same thing with your business ideas. If you have an early idea and you've fallen in love with it, it's probably because you wrote a business plan and you spent 6 months writing it. So don't.
Yeah. So don't. So test early, validate early, and then ultimately be willing to pivot or change your idea completely.
Exactly. Well said.
We're at the end of our time box. It was an honor to host you. It was such a pleasure. People are very excited about the way you presented, but hopefully some of the content also sticked with them. And the quote of your presentation is, I think, from Christoph, "Your baby is ugly, do it again." So thank you so much, Paris, and I hope to see you soon. Have a great day.
My pleasure. Take care. Thanks, Robert.